Andy, this is a delight to do this.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure.
Could you tell us how you got your start as a reporter and what your inspirations and motivations were that led you into investigative reporting?
I'll try to keep it a little bit short, but you were asking actually earlier about programs where schools have real practical applications in coursework. I was fortunate enough in the high school that I went to where we could actually be reporters for the town newspaper at the high school we were at. So instead of working for our school newspaper, I started off as a sports reporter for our local daily paper, started filing stories, and it was a lot of fun. I went to undergrad, continued to be a journalist, but the transition to investigative reporting, for me, along the way I had done several investigative stories, but those were largely sources or tips coming in kind of haphazardly. But the real turning point for me came because of a nonprofit organization that's based at the University of Missouri called Investigative Reporters and Editors. And it's an organization that trains people how to be investigative journalists and how to do things systematically. It's a nonprofit professional organization with conferences held all the time. And I went to the first time I ever went to one of their conferences was in 1988. And all of a sudden I realized, going to these panels, hearing all these reporters talking, even though I was at a small newspaper at the time, that the kind of work that I was beginning to aspire more and more to do is something that can be done regularly and routinely and systematically if you just learn more tools of the craft. So that started me on my way to doing investigative reporting.
Very good, thank you. I should comment here that we'll have lots of time afterwards for Q&A after I run through a series of questions here for maybe 35 minutes or so. But if anybody has an absolutely burning follow-up question, maybe I'll entertain it. You were one of the main reporters on the New York Times coverage of the Wikileaks release of a trove of diplomatic cables and war logs and Guantanamo detainee dossiers. Can you tell us what it was like to report that Wikileaks story?
It was an incredible experience. One that I wish I could bottle up and share with you all, you know, what it was like to be there in the moment. It was a mixture of things. First off, there was the knowing, for instance, that you know, the New York Times is a place that had broken the Pentagon Papers story, which had some similarities. We actually among ourselves would debate just how similar it really was. But you had reporters that were in a secreted room going through you know, secret, highly classified Pentagon papers from the Vietnam War era. And here we were about 30 some odd years later doing something similar, in this case with war logs or diplomatic cables. There's a lot of similarity, and Daniel Ellsberg, who leaked the Pentagon Papers, who'd certainly been one who said that there is a lot of similarities in the kinds of material. So for those of us who may be a little bit history nerds, you know, in our profession, that certainly was like something that gives you a moment pause. It was very intense, very collegial in that intensity. We were secreted in the building. Nobody knew what we were doing. Nobody was even supposed to know that we were all working together on anything. One time we all went to go to, for instance, we were going to the editor's office to go talk with him about something, and we all happened to be walking through the newsroom together. And we were immediately told to separate, not even to be seen walking together in the newsroom. So, so there was a high level of secrecy. But I think what's most important, setting aside all that kind of ephemera, is that going through the material, it was clear to us that there was valuable information that we believed that the American public deserved to know. So while there was, you know, the circus surrounding Julian Assange and his pronouncements in the issue, in the various issues during the course of the reporting, while there was a lot of pressure from various factions, you know, we did believe that that the material that we were going through was valuable for the American public, and our job, we felt, was to figure out what did people need to know out of this material.
Okay. So it's been more than a year since the WikiLeaks release. What do you think the lasting impact of that release has been?
That's a great question. You know, when you're a reporter in the heart of a story, you try to report on the things that you believe are the most important and it would have the most impact to your readers and to society at large. It's sometimes really hard to answer that kind of a question. I almost feel like it's better for other people to answer that kind of a question. But I think in a variety of ways, whether it's giving people a far more nuanced appreciation about, you know, how well our drones operate. You know, the war logs in the Afghanistan trove, for instance, showed us that there are a great deal of problems with our drones. And I think that our readers who read those stories would then not be surprised when one of our drones errantly flew into Iran. You know, that was something that, you know, that was not a one-off case that happened with Iran. We've known of many instances, and the war logs provided that window into our drones not working well in the battlefield. Whether it's the involvement of Pakistan's ISI in aiding the Taliban, whether it's going through the diplomatic cables and finding out, you know, just the inner workings of the Egyptian military. Certainly a very important issue even today as we examine the aftermath of their revolution. I mean, there's so many levels that that the diplomatic cables, that the war logs, and that the Guantanamo dossier shed light on, and that I hope that we were able to illuminate for our readers.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Any burning follow-ups here so far? Okay. Does the work of an investigative reporter ever present you with special ethical dilemmas that other journalists may not face? And if so, how do you address those? How do you deal with them?
You know, that's a great question, and it's there are a variety of dilemmas that you can encounter. So, for instance, with the diplomatic cables and war logs, I've been in situations before where we would be brought into a room with the top editors, the editors of the story, and with our lawyers on staff, and they would say, okay, this is what we believe is our exposure under libel law with this particular story. You know, let's start reviewing everything we have. Let's make sure about everything. With the WikiLeaks troves of documents, that was my first time where you're ever brought into a room and they close the door, and your lawyers are then describing your exposure to national security law and whether you could face the possibility of jail time under national security law. So
that would tend to get one's attention.
That does. So as far as you know, clear legal issues, you know, there have been many times when you're working on an investigative story where legal issues present themselves. Are there issues that go beyond just legal issues into the realm of ethical issues? I think that happened more, for myself, it happened more in my work at NBC, where we would sometimes do hidden camera work. And in hidden camera work, you know, it's really interesting. Some people think that network broadcasters are very quick to do hidden camera. Actually, it was the opposite for us. Hidden camera was always seen as more of a tool of last resort. Is there any other way to get the story and document the story than doing hidden camera? If not, then okay, maybe we'll go ahead with this. But we'd also ask ourselves other questions. You know, what's the public importance of doing this story? Will we be shedding light on something that the public would have had no other way of fully understanding or realizing if we didn't do this particular tact of reporting? So that deals a little bit more with methods. But clearly, you know, I mean, it's almost a story-by-story situation, but legal and ethical issues crop up all the time.
Okay. This is nothing new. The news industry is in a time of great upheaval and has been for a number of years with the rise of online news and
now you tell me.
yeah, sort of like the disruption in higher education,
right.
and of course uncertainty about how news will be funded.
Right.
How's investigative reporting faring in that sort of environment?
Well, first off, myself and my colleagues who do this kind of work at the New York Times, we're incredibly fortunate to be working for a news organization and a publisher who strongly believes in the value of investigative reporting. So I wouldn't want to sit in front of this audience any other way except to say, you know, first off, it's going to be organization by organization, and secondly, right now I work at an organization where we're incredibly blessed and fortunate to have that kind of support. I realize that it's not that way in every newsroom across the country. Sadly, I wish it were. But I do think if you were to go to, I mentioned earlier, investigative reporters and editors, if you were to go to their upcoming conference in Boston in June, you would see probably similar numbers that you would have seen when I went to my first investigative reporters and editors conference back in the 1980s. You know, maybe that's a sign that there's as many people doing investigative reporting now as we had 2 decades ago or 3 decades ago. I think that there are many indicators. What's different is when you look at the name tags. Back then it would have been a lot of print people with some broadcast people. Now when you go, you see a lot of broadcast people. You see fewer print people, but you also see a lot of online news organizations, and you see the growing wealth of nonprofit investigative news organizations that are out there, such as ProPublica, things like that. So there are other avenues where you can do investigative reporting, and it is a changing face, but there is a world for it. And I would also like to believe that, look, as things change, you know, there's all kinds of wonderful things that are out there now with social media. You can quickly follow on social media or on whether it's Twitter feeds or Facebook, or whether you're watching events live. You know, you don't need investigative reporters to tell you who won the Super Bowl or things like that. There are many kinds of breaking news that are getting covered by other avenues. But chances are, when you read an investigative story, most of the time it's still coming from people like myself who do investigative reporting. And so I think that there's a value added that people in doing my realm of work bring to a news organization that you just still can't get any other way. And I think that the hallmark, the thing that separates a place like the New York Times or many other, you know, well-established news organizations is, look, dear reader or dear viewer, we're giving you the daily coverage, but we're also giving you the kind of coverage that you can see nowhere else. And I think that as news organizations continue to try to differentiate themselves in the marketplace, investigative reporting is something that is not only something they should be doing as part of their social contract with the public, but I think it also has a benefit of saying, look, this is what differentiates ourselves and why you should still be buying us and reading us.
Okay. So you get a bonus for answering 2 questions in one.
But, oh, great. So I could just have the sip of water then.
Sure. But I'll ask this next one just the same in case there's any more that you would like to add here. And it has to do with the power that investigative reporting has to make a difference in the world of information overload. And I think you've just touched on that. Is there more that you would respond there of that kind of difference that investigative reporting can make? Yeah,
you know, I think that there, you know, when we begin a story, we do hope at some level it makes a difference. But it's, at least for me anyway, it's more of a vague notion as opposed to believing, oh, if we do this story, a certain law will be enacted or changes will occur. Those are things that I tend not to worry about so much, as opposed to asking myself, is this a story where the public should be knowing about this particular problem? Is this something where I believe I can advance the ball or shed light in an area that has gone unexamined? The questions about the after effects, those are always just so hard to gauge, that to think about those, particularly before a story gets published, is more, that's like energy that you're expending not on the story but on something that you have no control over.
Right.
But I still think that it's one of the things that's the hallmark of the better news organizations in our country, whether broadcast or print or online. So I just hope that more people, more news organizations continue to do this kind of work.
Thank you. This is a question that you and I touched on as we were visiting up here earlier. Some of your investigative reporting has taken you into international arenas all over the world. And I know a lot of our students have international interests, and I wonder if you have suggestions for our students whose careers might take them on such global directions.
Yeah, it's an incredible area that I think, I've talked about this with some of my colleagues where we've done a lot of investigative reporting domestically. I think this is going to be one of the growing areas in the coming years of investigative reporting. More and more countries are beginning to realize there's actually organizations now where journalists look at what our investigative reporters and editors have done in the States, and they're taking those kinds of lessons and applying them to the United Kingdom, to countries across Europe, as well as into Africa, Asia, and around the world, Latin America. I think the tools are transferable in many cases in investigative reporting. And the other thing that I would encourage students here to consider as well is, if you're not yet studying a foreign language, study a foreign language. You can use them. You'll be surprised in all the different ways that you can use them. I have a familiarity with Spanish and with German. I've used both for stories within the last 2 or 3 months. So these are skills that no one can take away from you. I totally encourage you, if you have any language skills, develop them. You will be using them, and you can be using them. I guess is that a long answer or a short answer?
That's a great answer.
Okay, there we go. I'll stop right there then.
For you, what were the most significant stories to come out of the Wikileaks release?
God, I've been asked this before, and I almost think it depends on your area of interest or what, some people, for instance, are far more interested in the role of China in our world today. So, for instance, for them, I think some of the most important stories are those where we examined how China, for instance, had engaged in using seemingly its military to plant computer viruses in some of the computer systems running throughout Western Europe, causing, I believe if I'm getting my facts correctly, a year or so later, that their computers were momentarily shut down. That their military capability is spread to that kind of a level. That's an incredibly important story for understanding, for getting a glimpse into how China is operating in the world today, and the level of their operations in cyber warfare. I would argue that if you're interested in the war in Afghanistan, certainly our stories examining the role of the ISI, or how things have been faring on the ground there, or how well drones have been operating, certainly give a look that the war is not going as rosy as the Pentagon was projecting, and those are, of course, lines of reporting that continue today.
Right.
And there are many other areas where we could go into and say, look, if your interest is in the Middle East, or Iran, or Russia, the stories there, I think, shed light just on the level of either mendacity or corruption or behind-the-scenes maneuvering that's going on in all those places. For those sources who I've said that I will never release their names, I've been able to hold true to that promise and never release their names, not even to my family, not even to my wife, and if I don't have to release it to, if I just have to tell one editor and no one else, just that one editor knows. So if you're making that level of a promise, you keep it. That's as a practitioner. I've never faced litigation to have my sources revealed, and I hope I never do, but I hope I would, again, hold on to that promise, whatever promises that I make. And I realize it's hard these days that in some cases, you could face jail time, and there have been obviously colleagues at the New York Times who've gone to jail over, not releasing their sources. On numerous occasions, or at least several that I can think of, as well as, colleagues at other publications. So I would hope that if I ever were faced with that problem, that's the recourse that I would take. But that is a promise you make. There are risks and hardships and difficulties that we face as reporters in the United States. It is humbling to meet, read about, or hear about the difficulties that colleagues face abroad, and the level of courage that those reporters have undertaken who've been in those situations is inspirational to me. Whether at the New York Times, a former colleague, David Rode, had been kidnapped when he'd been trying to meet up with Taliban leaders in Afghanistan. Barry Birak was kidnapped in Zimbabwe. Other colleagues covering the war in Libya had been held, I believe, by Gaddafi forces in very brutal circumstances. That's just at the New York Times that I can recount quickly off the top of my head, let alone, photographers shot at and wounded, or, facing, Joao Silva is a photographer who comes to mind, who's paralyzed now. Those people are inspirational. That's just the New York Times, let alone what you see going around the world at many other news organizations. So yes, there are clearly real risks, and I think it's up to those people to judge whether it's worth it. I mean, there are some reporters that say no story is worth your life, but clearly you can undertake stories where you don't yet know that those risks may run so severe. I've had reason to be worried on several occasions, but I always feel like it pales into comparison with some of the instances I've just described to you. So while there's been, voices threatening or things like that, it's not nearly what I've just described to you. So I'd feel even uncomfortable putting it on the same plane as, many other instances of what reporters have faced around the world. And if your question is, does the government keep track of reporters in general? I mean, clearly that's true. Whether it's a David Halberstam or reporters who've been covering wars today, and we know that many reporters are tracked. So does it go on? And clearly there are many documented cases where it has gone on and continues to go on. And then, if your question is if, again, with your us versus them and how you define those, I mean, have there been instances where corporations have gone after or investigated or somehow tried to browbeat reporters? I think there was I'm not familiar with the details at this point, but I think there was a famous case at Hewlett-Packard at one point where they were going after the reporters who were covering them. I mean, it does go on to some level or another. You know, in this country, we're afforded many protections that allow us to still do our work. I think that's probably the first focus I would have is, can I still do my work in whatever environment you're describing? And clearly it would be rougher for reporters in other countries. I don't know, does it?
To look into us.
Right, I would imagine, you know, I mean, from what I've read about reporters in Russia, for instance, that, you know, the level of government's tracking what you're doing or reporting on, and what that may imply is far more grave than it would be here. So here's the thing, like many times reporters, we're just incredibly competitive. And so most, you know, your classic example of reporters is, you know, that they just don't even talk to each other. You know, or if they do, they can be really brusque with their competitors or rivals. But what's unique about investigative reporters and editors is that we all go to these conferences, and by and large, people, you know, the spirit of the place is that people open up their notebooks and share how they go about doing their craft. So, and while it's an organization, it's made up of reporters from around the country talking about how we do these, how we do this work. So, yes, it's a nonprofit, but it's, you know, it's Bartlett and Steele, who had been at the Philadelphia Inquirer, and I think now are contributing editors to Vanity Fair. It's Pat Stith, who's an incredible reporter who recently retired from the Raleigh News and Observer. It's you know, it's folks like John Larson, who you had last year. You know, it's Walt Bogdanich, who's an incredible reporter at the New York Times. And it's reporters at, you know, small news organizations, larger news organizations. You know, it's Diana Enriquez, who recently retired from the New York Times and was a Pulitzer finalist and has done tremendous work. These are the kinds of people who go to these conferences and share with reporters, you know, even when they were, you know, as young and wet behind the ears as I was back in 1988, you know, they're taking their time out to talk and explain how they go about doing the craft. So what are some of the lessons that they impart? You know, they involve everything from how to use the Freedom of Information Act, how to find and develop and learn from sources, either on the beat or elsewhere in agencies or issues you want to cover, how to go and find the documentation that will, you know, expose or fully examine a particular issue, how to go about mining public records, or how to develop things that you might not think you'd be able to develop, and how to go about systematically critiquing your own story ideas. You know, am I on point? Am I focused enough as I go and launch this particular investigation? And also basic things like time management. You know, how long will it take me, do I think, to even turn around this story? Am I talking hours or days or weeks or months? You know, which at a small news organization, you don't get weeks or months. You know, so if I'm going to think of a story, you know, it better be something I can do in a few days. You know, so all those kinds of issues are the kinds of lessons that are imparted.
You've used the word systematically at least 3 times in describing your craft. Can you say more about that?
I was systematically trying to use the phrase system.
I mean, there's something
right
discipline-based there.
That's correct.
Like.
Yeah, there is, and in part I'm trying to do this at the class that I'm teaching now on campus. So how to give like the 2-minute version of that. It's partly to say, you know, look, there's not just one way to come across a story idea. It doesn't just have to be a source who calls you up and says, "Have I got a story for you?" It can be things like, you know, going through government audit reports and realizing, like, look, here's something that has gone completely unexamined. Why has no one fully examined what this auditor found 2 years ago? It could be going through and filing a Freedom of Information Act request for something that you think might be going on in your community. It could be going through the public record, whether it's hearing testimony or lawsuits or other things that could, that could just be like hiding in plain sight. There are actually many investigative stories that hide in plain sight. A colleague of mine at the New York Times and I just finished a story that in IRE circles we would call the hiding in plain sight story. Mm-hmm. And it was a story about how lead batteries, you all have cars, I would assume. That's how many of you probably got here. Well, chances are when you're done with your car battery, you have to take it to a place where they promise to recycle it. Well, where do many of those batteries go? It turns out many of those batteries go to Mexico. Well, the promise that the lead recyclers say is that these batteries will be safely recycled and then you'll get new batteries, and often the lead in your battery is recycled lead. But the way that lead is recycled in the United States, and there are a few facilities that still do it, and the way that lead is recycled in Mexico are two different things. You go to Mexico and lead is going to be cracked, these batteries are going to be cracked open in completely almost renegade conditions in some cases, next to schoolyards with lead floating into the air, where the contamination levels could be much higher, where workers are not wearing any safety equipment. And yet on paper, when you read EPA regulations, we're essentially promising that lead is going to be recycled in other nations at a high standard. But by checking the public record and by doing these kinds of inquiries, what we find is those rules that we see on paper are not true, and that a lot of lead is actually poorly recycled and then ends up back in our batteries. So we think we're doing a good thing, recycling lead, so that we're not mining more of this hazardous metal. But in fact, we're often shipping our problem off to another country where the standards are less and where people are still getting harmed doing it. So that story's been essentially hiding in plain sight for years. Other people could have done that story. Sure. So in this case, I was talking before about other languages. I mean, I was reading documents in Spanish, and also we had a terrific colleague at our Mexico City bureau who was making sure that I wasn't screwing up, and also asking questions, and asking terrific questions, by the way. But these would be documents like saying, are these facilities licensed? Does the government even know that lead is being recycled there? Have there been inspections? Do we know what the quality of the work is there? So it could be records like that. It could be also records like, reading the EPA's own rules. Like, what do they say should be going on? How is the system supposed, very often when we're doing an investigative story, you say, how is the system supposed to be working? And how is it really working? And those can often be two different things. And if the gap is huge, then you could think like, oh, I could really be onto a story here. So, for instance, my first experience working with John Larson, your Ottaway professor, last year, that story, the first story we ever worked on was an examination of State Farm, the nation's largest auto insurer, and how it pays its policyholders. And how the system is supposed to be working is that they pay their policyholders according to their injuries. And yes, there is insurance fraud out there, so they will have doctors and other medical professionals examining patients or checking the medical records of patients, of those injured, but in proper circumstances, paying everybody what they're owed. What we found the reality was something different. That was how the system was supposed to be working. How the system was actually working is that they had set up a series of ostensibly independent review boards, independent paper review companies that were supposed to be examining the medical records of patients. Well, it turns out what these people were doing was they were supposed to be doctors reading medical reports saying, oh, well, I have a question here. I'm not sure it's valid here. What these companies were actually doing was denying care. And that, of course, meant that State Farm was making higher profits. these companies were like an archipelago set up to deny services to their own policyholders. And that's what we exposed, and it led to State Farm facing a nationwide investigation. They paid out at least $1 million, if not more, in claims, faced other kinds of inquiries. So I guess that's another example of like, how is the system supposed to be working? How is it really working? But I think I could point to many stories that I've worked on where those kinds of issues are in play. When we did the China drug story, where it involved looking at how pharmaceutical chemicals, that's all the pills you take, prescription pills or over-the-counter medicines, are essentially, like a lot of manufacturing, it's a series of ingredients, and they're made in different facilities and then cobbled together in other facilities, and then that's the pill you take. Well, it turns out that many of the medicines, the chemical ingredients manufactured in China, are unregulated. So how is the system supposed to be working? It's supposed to be working that all the chemicals that you take in your pills are clean and regulated, and everyone knows that these facilities are well maintained, and everyone is keeping track and making sure that people do not suffer harm. And how is it really working? Well, there are gaps in the system. And because of that, people die and people get hurt. And there's counterfeit chemicals that are on the world's market, whether it's sold in the United States, or elsewhere in the Western world or elsewhere in developing nations. So that's one of the litmus tests that we have. Does that answer that, or did I go on too long?
Perfect.
You pick. Yeah. I find it so hard just to do my job that to go around critiquing other. I mean, it's clearly a constantly evolving process where editors are asking themselves the same question about that all the time. I mean, I'd be the last person in the world to want to critique like the style section of the Times. You wouldn't want me even going there. So, I just know that that there. When I go around the New York Times, I do not see a level of complacency. I see people constantly asking themselves whether it's in a styles or a more featurey section, or whether it's in the more hard news sections. And these are the kinds of questions people ask themselves all the time. And I'm sure that there are many ways that we could all be raising the bar, but I don't think it's out of like some kind of neglect where people are ignoring issues out there. I mean, I see people constantly asking, how can we be doing this better?
Wow. Morgan?
I have a simple question.
Oh, good.
On a daily basis, weekly, monthly, what are you reading and watching?
What am I reading and watching?
Keep informed in the media. Yeah.
Right. Well, it can depend on the cycle where I'm at in a story. If I'm near the end of a cycle of a story, like if I was doing the Wikileaks stories, I would be reading and watching next to nothing if it didn't relate to exactly what I was reporting on. Mm-hmm. Those stories, we were working on 4 or 5 hours of sleep. We were under incredible pressure for various competitive reasons to turn those stories around. So at a certain point in stories, the answer could be nothing. At other times, clearly I like to keep track of what other colleagues are doing, both within the New York Times as well as other, investigative reporting, that's being done. So it can vary. And by the way, in the spirit of Sunshine Month, are you talking about where you'd want your students to be filing Freedom of Information requests? First off, by the way, you don't always need to file a Freedom of Information request to get information. Very often we can find ourselves calling up government officials, and you don't need to go through the formal process. And in many ways that's preferable because you might get stuff quicker. But I can give you some examples if it may help. I also teach an investigative reporting class at CUNY in the fall. It's a graduate school of journalism. It's 3 doors down from the Times. Am I allowed to talk about that here? Can I?
Sure.
But I give my students assignments like that. So for instance, one of the things I do that's an easy FOIA is you can FOIA whether the FBI has ever investigated a famous individual. And you can FOIA that upon that person's passing. It becomes public record. So my students at CUNY broke stories about how the FBI kept track of David Halberstam, the journalist. My student who did that, I assigned that story to her. She turned it around. She got great pickup, not just locally in New York, but the story got picked up nationwide. And she was later profiled by the Society of Professional Journalists as an exemplary example of a student who used the Freedom of Information Act to expose something.
Probably profiled by the FBI too, huh?
That's right.
But we won't know that until she passes on.
That's right. A similar student used the same line of reporting to show how, to examine Geraldine Ferraro, for one-time vice presidential candidate. Her FBI file showed a lot about what she knew about the way that her campaign, money flowed through her campaign. Of course, there were many questions back in 1984 about illegally funneling of money into her campaign. And her FBI file revealed a lot about that. My students did that story. That was picked up by the New York Daily News. So that's a couple quick examples. What else? Well, students of mine examined how so we're talking about systematically finding story ideas. One of the things I have them do is, if you're curious about an agency or a particular realm, to go through and check, follow the money. The simple edict we all learned from Woodward and Bernstein days, follow the money. This student was interested in special education, went through the ledgers and saw that New York State and New York City spend millions of dollars every year to send students to a small private college in Massachusetts. She looked at that and she's like, what's up with that? And so it turns out that it was a school that has been written about. It's a school called the Judge Rottenberg Center that specializes in, I don't mean to shorthand this too much, but essentially they electrocute some of their students, electroshock therapy. It's a school that has been reported on a lot in the past. But what was really interesting, we examined a lot of the reporting that had been done in the past. No one had ever examined that while the school engages in this controversial method of electroshock therapy for their students, no one had ever examined that New York State students actually comprise more than half of their student population, and that if we looked across the country, actually many other states were now barring their students from going there. California, Illinois, other states. New York State was not barring their students, and in fact, if you did the math, which we did, we then FOIA to get certain records about the finances. New York State essentially props up this school in Massachusetts. If New York State were to pull the plug on all the students who go to this private school in Massachusetts, its line of business would fall apart. So what did those students FOIA? They FOIA'd a lot of financial records and audits, so we could find out just how deeply New York State was financing its operation. There were other records that we followed about why hasn't New York State shut down its flow of students there while other states have, and that was a different line of inquiry. But there's many things that students can FOIA, whether it's, and some things you don't need to FOIA, whether it's, what are the cleanest restaurants in New Paltz? So you can go and you can check those public records to find out, which places have a history of what they call critical food violations.
I showed my students that when we called it grubby grub.
There you go. There you go. To travel or other expense records that local politicians may have filed, to ethics filings that may be going on. I mean, there's all kinds of things that are in the public record. One of the sad things about many, we talk about the Freedom of Information Act, and you guys may be walking away with the impression that, oh, this is what journalists do all the time. That actually it's very sad. I think it's like some people have estimated that only about 1% or so of all FOIAs are actually filed by journalists. That very often it's, businesses seeking competitive information about their rivals. It's people getting this information for other reasons. Journalists are just a fraction of it. So if anything, you know, I hope to encourage journalists to, you know, the next generation, this younger generation in my class and hopefully in your class, to realize there are many tools that you have to go at that are at your disposal to get information. I would take a step back. I mean, realize that Julian Assange did not get the documents or make those public. You know, if there was a person who was more analogous to Daniel Ellsberg, oops. If there was a person who was more analogous to Daniel Ellsberg in the 1970s or late 60s, early 70s, it would probably be who we all believe to be, but no one can say for certain, is the Army officer Bradley Manning. So, just to differentiate, because if you were to think about the roles that those two people played, the person who actually got the documents and got them into the world is probably even more Bradley Manning. We just happen to think more about Julian Assange. Yes. So then if I were to rephrase your question, what do I think of Bradley Manning? I don't know.
Well, what do you think of the principle that there should be sunlight everywhere all the time?
And clearly there are instances where you don't want sunlight all the time. I mean, at the New York Times, when we got the Afghanistan war logs, it was really clear to us. I mean, if you were to ask me, when I got those documents in late June of 2010, would it have been? Yeah, am I right already? Wow, time flies. So in late June of 2010, right before the 4th of July weekend, is when I first got the Afghanistan war logs. I can tell you what my first few memos were. By the way, when we first got those war logs, this was, if for those who, if I can rewind back in time, the very first set of documents were the Afghanistan war logs that news organizations got. At that time, there were several news organizations, The Guardian, Der Spiegel, The New York Times. We got those. A colleague of mine, Eric Schmidt, had gone to London to go through those documents. Very first story meeting, what were we thinking? A one-day package of stories that would outline perhaps how many people had died in the war. That's what we were thinking these documents were good for. I was brought in to help go through the documents, and very quickly I was sending emails to the select group of us working on the stories that probably the one thing these records were not good for was trying to figure out how many people have died, civilians and combatants, in the war in Afghanistan. They were actually sloppy, poorly kept, big gaping holes. You know, shorthand, Pat Tillman was not in that trove of documents. You know, many other famous incidents of civilians and soldiers dying were not in those trove of documents. But going through those documents, there clearly were stories about the ISI, stories about drones. But those were among the first couple memos that I sent, what I just described to you, that we can't count war dead, that it does illuminate a lot about the ISI that we did not know, that it does illuminate about drones. One of my other early memos is, guess what? There are the names of informants here. And if we publish these documents wholesale, we could clearly be putting people's lives at risk. That discussion, as far as I know, had not been on the table until I started writing, until I filed that memo. I don't think any of us, for a moment, hesitated that we do not want to put people's lives at risk. When it's a clear situation, this is not hypothetical, you know, we could essentially be giving a shopping list to insurgents. So we made a very clear decision, you know, other people clearly reviewed what I was writing, that no, we were going to be very careful about what war logs we were publishing. Many colleagues worked on those, not just the Afghanistan war logs, but other series of stories. One of my colleagues is a brilliant, fearless reporter named Chris Chivers. And Chris is a former Marine. And Chris also realized there's another bit of information that was incredibly valuable to enemy combatants. and that is what's known as response times. If you looked at the war logs, they gave minute-by-minute descriptions about battles that our troops were in. And you could, in those minute-by-minute descriptions, realize that if you were an insurgent and you were to overrun a base, how long will it take before, other troops are brought in? And that's valuable information. If you know that you have 20 minutes, that could tell you that you could do 10 or 15 minutes of havoc and then quickly bail before the response comes, whatever that response time may be. Chris realized without the Pentagon raising that issue, we knew that that too would be something we would not want to make public, because we could be putting our own troops' lives at risk. So those are just two of many examples, that we have faced and make decisions on, for better or worse, where we don't want to put people's lives at risk.
Thank you. Yes.
Hi, I guess I'm just curious, with such a high level of competition and wanting to get a story out first, how much that, I guess, hinders your ability to investigate a story to the extent that you would want to, personally?
Right. Well, how long you'd want to investigate a story. Sometimes, we have editors who are saying, like, are we done yet? You've been doing this for weeks or months. And as reporters, we sometimes can fall into the trap of like going on and on. If they'll give us the leash long enough, we'll keep going. The first answer is, I think none of us would argue that we should publish a story, half-baked. If we're not sure of what we're publishing, we're not going to publish it just because we think someone else is going to have it. We want to make sure that if whatever we do publish, we have right. We sometimes talk about, are we hearing footsteps, on a story? And sometimes when you're hearing footsteps, maybe what you'll do is you'll break out a piece of your story so that you can, say to the competition, we're here too, and we're going to, stomp really hard if you try to even get close, and, first get out the one piece that we hear the competition close at, and then maybe, so you may change your approach in how you're going to publish a piece. Instead of having the big Sunday package, maybe you do several smaller stories because you're trying to, deal with competitive factors. But if your question is, are we going to cut short the veracity or the quality of checking, no. The answer is no. Will we change the way we might publish a piece? Yes. Might there be some things that we might say, well, look, it'd be really nice to have this element to the story, but because of competitive reasons, we're going to say that element was nice, but it's a secondary consideration. We can still get the bulk of the story in there. Those kinds of conversations occur. Sure. It goes on so many levels. At some point you could, I'm not sure I'm going to entirely answer your question satisfactorily, but if I could just tell you, like when you're writing a story, sometimes you could be working on something for so long that you can forget, what brought you there or what got you excited at the very beginning. So you want to make sure that you convey to the readers, or your viewers, what are those, basic human tantalizing elements that can bring your people into the story. So sometimes making things real or palpable. Sometimes if you're getting into a story that's incredibly complex, it could be like, you could start assuming that everyone has all of a sudden developed this body of knowledge. And you have to break it down so that no one has to bring any body of knowledge, really to your piece. So, so sometimes it's just breaking things down and making sure that, you're not assuming too much knowledge. So there's many different things. And obviously, space and time limitations, whether in broadcast or print, you may think that the New York Times has limited space. I can tell you that, if you were to go and check the average lengths of stories, it's gone down. We only get a certain amount of space to do these pieces. And maybe we get some more on blogs, but, picking and choosing your shots carefully.
It's a great place to end. Thank you both so much.
Thank you. Thanks. Hope it was okay.
Thank you all.